The dust of Redemption Gulch tasted of rust and regret. It clung to the back of Ilara's throat, a constant reminder of the dryness in her soul. She stood before the mercantile, the splintered wood of the notice board pressing against her cheek. As she read the words that had become her public crucifixion, notice of public shaming, the ink bled, stark against the yellowed paper. Ilara Vance, widow, for the crime of insolvency and vagrancy, shall be subjected to the town's judgment at high noon. High noon was a breath away. The sun, a merciless eye in the bleached sky, was almost directly overhead. Her late husband, a good man named Thomas, had left her with nothing but a heart full of memories and a belly full of their unborn child. The child was gone now, a whisper of a life lost to hunger and grief one cold, starless night. The memories were fading, eroded by the constant gnawing of an empty stomach and the sharp, pitying glances of the townsfolk. Her hand, thin and trembling, went to her flat stomach. A phantom ache bloomed there, a cruel echo of the life that had been. She was a husk, a woman hollowed out by loss. The townsfolk were gathering in the square, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous piety. They were good, church-going people, but the frontier had a way of hardening hearts, of turning survival into a virtue that overshadowed compassion. Sheriff Brody, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his uniform and whose heart was as small and hard as a river stone, stood by the stocks, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He was the one who had championed this punishment, his voice booming in the saloon about making an example of her, about the need for order and the swift punishment of those who became a burden. Ilara's gaze swept over the crowd, searching for a single friendly face, a flicker of kindness in the sea of judgment. She found none. Not even from Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, to whom she had given the last of her husband's silver buttons for a stale loaf of bread just last week. Now Mrs. Gable stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of stern disapproval. The whispers started, a low hiss like snakes in dry grass. Look at her. Shameless. Thomas would be turning in his grave, a burden on us all. Each word was a stone, and Ilara felt the bruises forming on her spirit. Then, a small sound cut through the murmurs. A child's cry. Near the edge of the crowd, a little girl with tangled blonde hair and a dirt-smudged face was weeping, her small body shaking with silent sobs. Her mother, a woman with weary eyes in the same threadbare dress Ilara had seen on a dozen other women in this town, tried to shush her, her own face tight with a mixture of shame and fear. The girl was hungry. Ilara knew that cry. It was the sound of a belly twisted in on itself, the desperate plea of a body consuming itself. Without thinking, without weighing the cost, Ilara moved. Her feet, bare and cracked, carried her across the dusty square, away from the stocks and towards the child. The crowd parted before her, a silent, disapproving wave. She reached into the small linen pouch tied at her waist. Inside was the last thing of value she owned in this world, a small, hard piece of bread. It was her ration for the next 2 days, the only thing standing between her and utter collapse. She had saved it, nibbling at the edges, making it last. It was her survival. She knelt before the crying child, her knees protesting on the hard-packed earth. The little girl looked up, her blue eyes wide and swimming with tears. Ilara's heart, a thing she thought had turned to stone, cracked. She saw her own lost child in those eyes. She saw her own hunger, her own despair. She held out the bread. "Here," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. "For you." The child's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "No, ma'am, you can't." But Ilara's eyes were fixed on the little girl. The child hesitated, looking from the bread to her mother, then back to Ilara. Slowly, her small, grimy hand reached out and took the offering. She clutched it to her chest as if it were a treasure, her sobs quieting. Ilara's hand lingered in the air for a moment, almost touching the child's cheek, before she let it fall. She had given away her last hope. A strange sense of peace settled over her. Let them put her in the stocks. Let them shame her. In this one small act, she had reclaimed a piece of her own humanity. She stood up and turned to face the sheriff. Her back straight, her head held high. The crowd was silent now, their faces unreadable. The moment had shifted. Something had broken in the air, something other than Alara's spirit. Sheriff Brody's face was thunderous. She had defied him, had stolen the focus of his cruel theater. Get her! He roared, his voice cracking the silence. 2 deputies moved towards her, their hands reaching for her arms. But before they could touch her, a voice, deep and resonant as the tolling of a church bell, cut through the air. I'll take her. The words hung in the hot, still air, heavy with authority. The crowd turned as one, their gazes shifting to the man who had spoken. He sat on a powerful black stallion at the edge of the square, a shadow against the blinding sun. He was tall in the saddle, with broad shoulders and a face carved from granite and grief. His hat was pulled low, casting his eyes in shadow, but there was no mistaking the quiet power that radiated from him. It was Silas Blackwood, the rancher from the high country, a man who kept to himself, a man whispered to be as wild and untamed as the land he worked. A widower, they said. A man whose own heart had been shattered. He dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. He walked towards her, his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, never leaving hers. The deputies froze, uncertain. Sheriff Brody puffed out his chest, but a flicker of fear showed in his eyes. Silas Blackwood was not a man to be trifled with. He owned half the valley, and his silence was more intimidating than any man's threat. Silas stopped in front of Alara, so close she could feel the heat coming off his body. He looked down at her, his gaze taking in her torn dress, her bare feet, the defiant tilt of her chin. He saw the hollowness in her cheeks, but he also saw the fire that still burned in the depths of her eyes. He had seen her give away her last piece of bread. He had seen her choose compassion over survival. And in that moment, he had seen a reflection of the goodness he thought had vanished from the world, the same goodness he had buried with his wife. He turned his head slightly, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the square. She is no longer a vagrant. She will have a home. He looked at Sheriff Brody, a silent challenge passing between them. And she is no longer insolvent. I will pay her debts. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a heavy leather pouch, tossing it onto the ground at the sheriff's feet. The clink of coins was a sound of finality. Then he turned back to Alara. His shadowed eyes held a question, a silent offer that was more than just a rescue. It was a lifeline, a chance at something she had thought was lost forever. He didn't offer a hand. He simply waited. For a long moment, Alara couldn't breathe. The world had tilted on its axis. This stranger, this ghost from the mountains, had stepped out of the shadows and rewritten her fate. She looked at the stocks, then at the faces in the crowd, and finally, back at the man standing before her. She saw the loneliness in his eyes, a mirror of her own. They were 2 broken souls, standing in the dust under a merciless sun. With a slow, deliberate nod, she gave him her answer. It was not a tinto, yes to a proposal, but a surrender to a new, terrifying, and unknown beginning. Silas Blackwood nodded once in return, a silent acknowledgement of the pact they had just made. He turned and walked back to his horse, expecting her to follow. And as Alara took the first step away from the gallows of her old life and towards the shadow of the mountain man, she didn't know if she was being saved or simply traded from one form of bondage to another. All she knew was that the taste of dust in her mouth was now mingled with the faint, unfamiliar taste of hope. The ride to Silas's ranch was a silent one. Alara sat behind him on the great black horse, her hands resting hesitantly on his lean hips, her body stiff and sore. The sun beat down on them, and the landscape shifted from the dusty, claustrophobic streets of Redemption Gulch to the wide, open expanse of the high country. The air grew cooler, cleaner, scented with pine and damp earth. They rode for hours. The rhythmic sway of the horse, a lulling, hypnotic motion. Olara watched the landscape unfold, the jagged peaks of the mountains clawing at the sky, the valleys deep and green. It was a beautiful, brutal country, much like the man whose back was a rigid wall in front of her. She knew the stories about Silas Blackwood. They said he had come from the East, a wealthy man who had bought the old Miller Ranch and transformed it into the most prosperous spread in the territory. They said his wife, a fragile beauty with hair like spun gold, had died in childbirth, taking their son with her. They said Silas had buried them himself, up on the ridge overlooking the valley, and that a part of him had been buried with them. He rarely came to town, and when he did, his silence was a fortress. He was a ghost, a legend, a man more myth than flesh and blood. And now she was his. The thought sent a tremor of fear through her. What had she done? What had he done? Why? Had he intervened? Pity? A fleeting sense of charity? Or something else, something she couldn't yet name? The ranch, when they finally reached it, was nestled in a valley carved by an ancient river. It was a sprawling, formidable place, the main house built of dark, sturdy logs, with a wide porch and windows that looked like vacant eyes. Barns and corrals dotted the landscape, and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance was a low, constant hum. It was a place of work, of substance, of a life lived far from the prying eyes of the town. It was also a place steeped in silence and sorrow. Silas dismounted and then turned to help her down. His hands were large and calloused, and his touch was surprisingly gentle as he lifted her from the horse. For a moment, she stood before him, her bare feet sinking into the soft grass, the dust of the town still clinging to her clothes. He looked at her, his face unreadable in the fading light. "The house is this way," he said, his voice a low rumble. He led her to the front door and pushed it open. The inside was dark and cool, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, leather, and something else. A faint, lingering scent of lavender, like a memory that refused to fade. The house was a man's house, clean but stark. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, its hearth cold and black. Furniture, heavy and dark, was covered in dust cloths, as if the life of the house had been put to sleep. It was a mausoleum, not a home. "There's a room upstairs," Silas said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "The one on the left. You can stay there." He didn't look at her. He was already moving towards the back of the house, towards the kitchen. "There's water in the basin, and clothes in the wardrobe. They were my wife's." Ilara stood frozen in the center of the room, a ghost in a ghost's house. The weight of his words, of his loss, settled on her like a shroud. She was an intruder here, a trespasser on sacred ground. Slowly, she made her way up the creaking stairs. The room he had indicated was at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside. It was a woman's room, but it felt like a tomb. A large four-poster bed, its linens crisp and white, stood against one wall. A rocking chair sat by the window, a small half-finished piece of knitting still in a basket beside it. On the dresser, a silver-backed brush and comb lay next to a small porcelain doll. And in the wardrobe, as he had said, were the clothes. Dresses of fine wool and soft cotton, in shades of blue and cream and rose. They were the clothes of a beloved wife, a cherished woman. Ilara touched the sleeve of a blue dress, the fabric soft as a whisper against her rough fingers. A wave of guilt and sorrow washed over her. She had no right to be here, to wear this dead woman's clothes, to sleep in her bed. She turned away, her throat tight. She would not wear them. She would not erase the memory of the woman who had. lived and loved in this house. She found the basin and pitcher on a small washstand and poured the cool water. She scrubbed the dirt and grime from her face and hands, the water turning gray in the bowl. She washed her feet, the cracks and cuts, stinging as the water cleaned them. She felt a little more human, a little less like the vagrant from the town square. When she came downstairs, Silas was in the kitchen, standing over the stove. He had started a fire, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. He didn't turn when she entered. He seemed to sense her presence, a silent awareness, passing between them. He had taken off his hat, and she could see his face clearly for the first time. It was a handsome face, but it was etched with lines of grief that seemed too deep for a man his age. His hair was black as a raven's wing, and his eyes, when he finally turned to look at her, were the color of a winter sky. "There's food," he said, his voice gruff. He gestured to the table, where he had set out a plate with bacon, eggs, and a thick slice of bread. It was more food than Alara had seen in months. Her stomach clenched with a painful, desperate hunger. She sat down, her hands trembling as she picked up the fork. She ate slowly, deliberately, forcing herself not to devour the food like a starving animal. Each bite was a small miracle, a taste of life returning to her body. Silas sat across from her, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. He didn't eat. He just watched her, his gaze intense and unnerving. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick and heavy with unspoken questions. Why had he brought her here? What did he want from her? Was she to be his servant, his housekeeper, or something more? The fear, which had receded, returned with a vengeance. When she had finished, she pushed the plate away, her stomach full for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Silas nodded, his eyes still on her. "There are rules," he said, his voice low and flat. "This is my house, my wife's house. You will respect it." He paused, his gaze dropping to the table. "You will not go into her room, the one at the end of the hall." Ilura's heart skipped a beat. He thought she had been in the other room, the one that was clearly his. She hadn't even noticed it. "I was in the room on the left," she said quietly, "the one you told me to use." His head snapped up, his eyes locking with hers. Flicker of something, surprise, confusion, crossed his face. "That was her room," he said, his voice tight. "Her sewing room." He looked away, a muscle working in his jaw. "It doesn't matter. Just stay out of the master bedroom. That was our room." "I will," she promised, her voice soft. He stood up, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. "There's work to be done. The garden needs tending. The chickens need feeding. I expect you to earn your keep." He walked to the door, then paused, his back to her. "I am not a kind man, Alara," he said, his voice so low she could barely hear it. "Do not expect kindness from me. I offered you a roof over your head and food in your belly, nothing more." He left without another word, the screen door slamming shut behind him. Ilara sat alone in the silent kitchen, the smell of lavender and loss clinging to the air. She was a prisoner, not a guest. A worker, not a companion. She had escaped the public shame of the town only to find herself in a private prison of a grieving man's heart. She looked around the stark, clean kitchen, at the dust cloths covering the furniture in the next room, at the cold, empty hearth. This was not a home. It was a tomb. And she, a ghost in a dead woman's house, was tasked with the impossible. To find a way to live again, in a place where life itself seemed to have ended. The struggle for survival had just begun, and it was a battle she would have to fight not with her body, but with her soul, against the silence and the sorrow of the man who had saved her. The days that followed bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of work and silence. Alara rose before the sun, her body aching from the unfamiliar labor. She fed the chickens, their clucking a welcome sound in the oppressive quiet of the ranch. She collected the eggs, their warmth a small comfort in her cold hands. She tended the garden, a patch of earth that had been neglected for too long. She pulled weeds until her fingers were raw, her nails caked with dirt. She watered the thirsty plants, her own thirst for a kind word, a simple acknowledgement going unquenched. Silas was a constant, silent presence. He worked from sunup to sundown, his energy boundless, his focus absolute. He mended fences, broke wild horses, and managed his vast herds with a grim determination. He moved with a purpose that seemed to be fueled by a deep, unyielding pain. He rarely spoke to her, and when he did, his words were clipped and functional. "The well pump is sticking. There's a storm coming in from the west. We need more firewood." Alara learned to read his moods by the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. She learned to anticipate his needs, to have a hot meal ready when he came in from the fields, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. She scrubbed the floors of the cabin until the wood gleamed. She washed the dust cloths and folded them away, letting the dark, heavy furniture breathe again. She polished the silver until it shone, her own reflection a ghostly image in its surface. She was trying to bring the house back to life, to chase away the shadows that clung to its corners. But the silence remained, a thick, suffocating blanket. The evenings were the hardest. They would sit at the kitchen table, the space between them a chasm of unspoken thoughts and feelings. Alara would sew, mending Silas's work shirts, her needle a small silver flash in the lamplight. Silas would clean his rifles or read from a worn, leather-bound book, his face a mask of concentration. The air would be thick with the ghosts of what might have been, of the wife who should have been sitting in her chair, of the child whose laughter should have filled the silent house. One evening, a week after she had arrived, she found the courage to speak. "The garden is doing well," she said, her voice small in the large room. "The tomatoes are starting to ripen." Silas looked up from his book, his eyes unreadable. He said nothing for a long moment, and Alara's heart began to pound in her chest. She had broken the unspoken rule. She had tried to bridge the gap. Finally he nodded. "Good," he said, and then his eyes returned to the page. The single word was both a dismissal and an acknowledgement. It was a small crack in the wall of his silence, and Alara clung to it like a lifeline. She began to speak to him more, her words small offerings dropped into the vast well of his grief. She told him about the fox that had been trying to get into the chicken coop. She told him about the patch of wild raspberries she had found by the creek. She didn't expect a response, not really. She was simply trying to fill the silence, to remind herself that she still had a voice. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the mountains, the sky turning a bruised purple. The wind howled, and the rain came down in sheets, lashing against the windows of the cabin. Alara rushed to bring in the laundry from the line, her thin dress soaked through in seconds. She was struggling with a heavy basket when Silas appeared at her side, his face grim. He took the basket from her without a word and carried it inside. They were trapped in the cabin for the rest of the day, the storm raging around them. The fire in the hearth was the only source of light and warmth. Alara made a pot of stew, the savory aroma filling the small space. They ate in their usual silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the drumming of the rain on the roof. After they had eaten, Alara went to the window, looking out at the storm-tossed landscape. The wind was tearing at the trees, and the creek was rising. Its waters a muddy, churning torrent. "It's a bad one," she said, more to herself than to him. "I've seen worse," Silas said from his chair by the fire. She turned to look at him. His face was illuminated by the firelight, the shadows dancing across his features. For the first time, she saw not just the grief, but the exhaustion beneath it. He was a man carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear. "Tell me about her," she said, her voice soft. The words were out before she could stop them. It was a dangerous, forbidden question. Silas's body went rigid. The book in his hands fell to the floor with a soft thud. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight. Ilara held her breath, her heart pounding. She had gone too far. She had trespassed on the most sacred ground of all. Her name was Sarah, he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. The sound of her name in the silent room was a shock, a ghost made suddenly real. She loved the wildflowers in the spring. She had a laugh that could make the sun come out on a cloudy day. He paused, his throat working. She wanted a child more than anything, a son. He fell silent, the memories overwhelming him. Ilira's heart ached for him, for the depth of his loss. She crossed the room and knelt by his chair. She didn't touch him. She just knelt there, a silent witness to his pain. She died in that bed upstairs, he said, his voice breaking. Her and the boy. I couldn't save them. The doctor was too late. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders, shaking with silent, racking sobs. Ilira's own eyes filled with tears. She knew that pain. She knew the emptiness of a life lost before it had even begun. She reached out, her hand hesitating for a moment before she placed it on his arm. His muscles were corded with tension. He didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch, a silent, desperate plea for comfort. She stayed there with him, her hand on his arm, until the storm of his grief had passed. The rain outside softened to a gentle patter, and the fire burned down to glowing embers. He finally lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and raw. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw not the vagrant from the town, but a woman who understood his pain, a woman who had her own ghosts. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I shouldn't have. I haven't spoken her name since." "It's all right," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's all right to remember." In the quiet aftermath of the storm, something had shifted between them. The wall of his silence had been breached, not by her words, but by their shared sorrow. They were no longer just a master and a servant, a savior and a victim. They were two broken people, finding a fragile, tentative connection in the wreckage of their lives. The house was still a place of sorrow, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a place where healing, however slow and painful, might just be possible. The struggle was far from over, but now, they were no longer fighting it alone. The news of Ilara's new life at the Blackwood Ranch spread through Redemption Gulch like wildfire. It was the main topic of gossip at the general store, the saloon, and the sewing circle. The reactions were a predictable mix of shock, disapproval, and envy. "Bought her, he did," mumbled Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, right out from under the sheriff's nose. "Paid her debts and took her up to that lonely place of his." Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, sniffed disdainfully. "It's a scandal, is what it is. A man of his standing taking in a woman of her reputation, a vagrant. And barren too, from what I hear." Her words were sharp, laced with the venom of a woman whose own life was a series of small disappointments. The whispers followed Ilara like a shadow on the rare occasions she had to go into town for supplies. She would ride in on the wagon, her back straight, her gaze fixed ahead, pretending not to hear the hushed comments, not to see the pointed stares. The women would pull their children closer as she passed, as if her misfortune were a contagious disease. The men would watch her with a mixture of pity and a crude speculative curiosity. Sheriff Brody was the most vocal in his condemnation. He saw Silas's actions as a personal affront, a challenge to his authority. "He's making a mockery of this town's laws," he would thunder in the saloon, his face flushed with whiskey and indignation. "Harboring a degenerate. It'll bring nothing but trouble, you mark my words." But there were other voices, quieter and more compassionate. The mother of the little girl to whom Ilara had given her last piece of bread, a woman named Mary, would always meet Ilara's gaze with a look of profound gratitude. She would offer a small, shy smile, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them in that moment of shared desperation. Old Man Hemlock, the town's doctor, a man who had seen more than his share of suffering, defended Silas's actions. "The man's got a good heart, buried under all that grief," he told a group of men at the mercantile. "And the woman, she showed more Christian charity in one moment than most of you show in a lifetime. Maybe they deserve a chance at a little peace." The community was divided, a line drawn in the dust between judgment and empathy. The tension came to a head one Sunday morning. Ilara, at Silas's quiet suggestion, had decided to attend the church service. It was a terrifying prospect, but she knew it was a necessary step. She could not hide on the ranch forever. She needed to face the town, to show them that she was not ashamed. She wore one of Sarah's dresses, a simple, modest gown of dark blue wool. It felt strange to be wearing another woman's clothes, but her own dress was little more than rags. As she and Silas walked towards the small, white-steepled church, a hush fell over the crowd gathered outside. All eyes were on them. The whispers were a palpable force, a wave of hostility that washed over her. They took a seat in a pew at the back, the space around them clearing as if they were lepers. Ilara could feel the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on her back. She kept her gaze fixed on the altar, her hands clenched in her lap. Silas sat beside her, a solid, unmovable presence. He did not look at the other members of the congregation. He did not seem to care what they thought. His presence was a shield, and Ilara was grateful for it. The Reverend Matthews, a man with a booming voice and a fire and brimstone style of preaching, began his sermon. He spoke of sin and redemption, of the wickedness of the flesh, and the importance of public morality. His words were a thinly veiled attack on Ilara and Silas, and every eye in the church was on them. Ilara's face burned with shame. She wanted to shrink into herself, to disappear. Then, something unexpected happened. Mary, the mother of the hungry child, stood up from her seat in the middle of the church. She was holding her little girl's hand. In her other hand, she held a small, freshly baked loaf of bread. She walked slowly, deliberately, down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the silent church. She stopped at Ilara's pew. She held out the loaf of bread. "For you," she said, her voice clear and strong. A kindness returned. A gasp went through the congregation. Reverend Matthews stopped his sermon, his mouth agape. Ilara looked up at Mary, her eyes filling with tears. She took the bread, her hands trembling. It was a simple gift, but it was a powerful statement. It was an act of defiance, of solidarity. Then another figure rose. It was Old Man Hemlock. He walked to their pew and placed a small jar of honey on the seat beside Ilara. "For the bitterness," he said with a wink. One by one, others followed. A farmer with a basket of fresh eggs, a young woman with a bouquet of wildflowers, a rancher with a slab of bacon wrapped in brown paper. They came, not with judgment, but with offerings of peace and acceptance. They were the outcasts, the quiet ones, the people who understood that life on the frontier was hard enough without turning on one another. The pew around Ilara and Silas filled with gifts, a testament to the power of a single act of kindness. The whispers of the gossips were silenced, replaced by a stunned, grudging respect. Sheriff Brody and his cronies looked on, their faces masks of fury and disbelief. They had lost. The tide of public opinion had turned. Ilara sat amidst the offerings, the warmth of the fresh bread on her lap, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. She looked at Silas. His face was still a mask, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a softening of the hard lines around his mouth. He reached out and placed his large, calloused hand over hers. It was the first time he had touched her with such open tenderness. In the quiet, stunned silence of the church, a new family was being forged, not of blood, but of shared struggle and mutual respect. And the community, once a source of judgment and pain, was becoming a source of strength and support. They had been broken, Alara and Silas, two lonely souls adrift in a harsh and unforgiving world. But now, in this small, dusty church, surrounded by the quiet kindness of strangers, they were beginning to feel whole again. The whispers had not disappeared entirely, but they had been drowned out by the louder, more powerful voice of compassion. The battle for their place in this community was not over, but they had won a crucial victory, not with words or with weapons, but with the simple, undeniable power of a shared loaf of bread. The fragile peace they had found was shattered by the arrival of a letter. It came by way of the circuit rider, a thin, wiry man who brought news and mail to the outlying ranches. The letter was addressed to Alara in a spidery, unfamiliar hand. Her heart pounded as she took it, a cold sense of dread washing over her. Good news rarely traveled so far. She opened it with trembling fingers, Silas watching her from across the kitchen table, his face a mask of concern. The letter was from a lawyer in St. Louis. It was short, and its words were like a punch to the gut. Her late husband Thomas had not been an orphan, as he had claimed. He had a family, a wealthy, powerful family, who had disowned him when he had married Alara, a woman they considered beneath him. Now with Thomas dead, they had learned of her existence, and of her public disgrace in Redemption Gulch. They were coming to reclaim their family's honor. The letter was a threat, a declaration of war. It ended with a chilling line: "We will not allow the Vance name to be dragged through the mud by a woman of your character. We will see you stripped of everything, including the name you so brazenly." Carrie, Alara's blood ran cold. They were coming to destroy her, to erase her from the memory of the man she had loved. She felt a wave of nausea and stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. The letter fluttered to the floor. Silas was at her side in an instant, his hands on her shoulders, steadying her. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight with alarm. She couldn't speak. She could only point to the letter on the floor. He picked it up and read it, his face growing darker with each word. When he finished, he crumpled the paper in his fist, his knuckles white. "They will not touch you," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "This is your home now. You are not alone." But the Vances were a force to be reckoned with. They arrived a week later, not in a dusty wagon, but in a fine black carriage drawn by two magnificent gray horses. They were a formidable trio. Thomas's father, a stern, silver-haired patriarch with cold, unforgiving eyes. His mother, a woman draped in black silk and diamonds, her face a mask of haughty disdain. And his brother, a younger, crueler version of his father, with a sneer that seemed permanently etched on his face. They did not come to the ranch. They went straight to Sheriff Brody, their wealth and influence a powerful weapon. They bought him body and soul. They filed a lawsuit, a public claim against Alara. They accused her of fraud, of marrying Thomas under false pretenses, of besmirching the family name. They demanded that she be stripped of her right to call herself a Vance, that she be run out of the territory as a charlatan and a whore. They wanted to utterly annihilate her. The town, which had so recently shown her a glimmer of acceptance, was once again thrown into turmoil. The Vances' wealth was intoxicating, their power intimidating. The whispers started again, louder, and more vicious this time. The fair-weather friends who had offered her bread and honey now averted their eyes, their courage failing them in the face of this new, more powerful enemy. A court date was set. The trial was to be held in the town hall, a public spectacle designed to humiliate and destroy her. Alara was terrified. She felt like a rabbit caught in a trap, the steel jaws closing in on her. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear into the mountains and never come back. "We will fight them," Silas said, his voice a bedrock of calm. "In the storm of her fear, we will not let them win." The day of the trial dawned gray and overcast, the sky mirroring the gloom in Alara's heart. The town hall was packed, every seat filled, the air thick with anticipation and malice. The Vances sat at the front, a formidable phalanx of wealth and arrogance. Sheriff Brody sat beside them, his face smug and triumphant. Alara sat beside Silas, her hands twisted in her lap. She felt small and insignificant, a piece of driftwood about to be consumed by a tidal wave. The judge, a man brought in from the county seat, was a stern, impartial figure, his face giving nothing away. The Vance's lawyer, a slick, well-dressed man from the city, began the proceedings. He painted a picture of Alara as a conniving, ambitious woman who had trapped a young, naive man from a good family. He spoke of her public shaming, her vagrancy, her insolvency. He used the words like weapons, each one a blow to her already battered spirit. When it was Silas's turn to speak, he did not call a lawyer. He stood up himself, his tall frame dominating the room. He was not an eloquent man, but his words had the weight of truth, the power of conviction. He spoke of Alara's kindness, of her courage. He told the story of the last piece of bread, of her selfless act, of compassion in the face of her own starvation. "You speak of her character," he said, his voice ringing with a quiet fury as he looked at the Vances. "You, who disowned your own son for the crime of loving a good woman. You, who would see his widow destroyed to protect your precious. Name, you know nothing of character. You know nothing of honor." He then called his first witness. It was Mary, the mother of the hungry child. She walked to the front of the room, her head held high. She told the story of Alara's kindness, her voice clear and unwavering. "She saved my daughter," she sighed, her eyes filling with tears. "She gave us hope when we had none." Next came Old Man Hemlock. He spoke of Alara's resilience, of the quiet dignity with which she had borne her suffering. He spoke of the life she was building at the ranch, of the way she had brought a spark of warmth and light back into a house of sorrow. One by one, they came forward, the quiet, forgotten people of Redemption Gulch, the farmer, the young woman. With the wildflowers, the rancher. They stood before the court and bore witness to Alara's character, their simple, honest words a powerful counterpoint to the Vance's venomous accusations. The tide in the room began to turn. The faces of the townsfolk, once hostile and judgmental, began to soften with a dawning understanding, a grudging respect. The Vances looked on, their faces masks of disbelief and rage. Their power, their wealth, was being challenged by the simple, undeniable truth of human decency. The climax came when Silas called his final witness, himself. He took the stand and looked directly at the judge. "The Vances claim that Alara has no right to their name," he said, his voice resonating with a deep, powerful emotion. "They are right. She deserves a better one." He turned and looked at Alara, his stormy eyes filled with a tenderness she had never seen before. "Alara Vance," he said, his voice softening, "I am not a man of many words. I am a broken man in a broken house. But you have started to mend me. You have brought light into my darkness. You have shown me what it means to live again." He took a deep breath, his next words a vow spoken before the entire town. "I am asking you, in front of God and all these witnesses, to be my wife. To take my name. To be the mother of my home, the partner of my life. To let me protect you and cherish you for all my days." A collective gasp went through the room. Alara's heart stopped. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This was not part of the plan. This was not a legal strategy. This was a declaration, a raw, honest, and utterly unexpected proposal of marriage. Tears streamed down her face, tears not of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was painful. She looked at this man, this silent, grieving man who had saved her. who had fought for her, who was now offering her everything he was. She saw not a savior, but a partner. Not a master, but an equal. She stood up, her legs trembling. She walked towards him, her eyes locked with his. The crowd, the judge, the Vances. They all faded away. There was only him. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Yes, Silas, I will." He stepped down from the stand and took her in his arms, his embrace strong and sure. The courtroom erupted, not with whispers or with judgment, but with a roar of applause, a wave of joyous, cathartic celebration. The Vances sat stunned, their faces pale with defeat. Their power had been broken, their hatred rendered impotent by the simple, unassailable power of love. The judge banged his gavel, a smile finally breaking through his stern demeanor. "Case dismissed," he boomed over the noise. Sheriff Brody, his face the color of spoiled meat, tried to slink out of the room, but he was met by a wall of disapproving glares. His reign of petty tyranny was over. That afternoon, under the vast open sky of the high country, with the mountains as their witness and their small, loyal band of friends as their congregation, Alara and Silas were married. Old Man Hemlock, who was also a justice of the peace, performed the ceremony on the porch of the cabin. Alara wore the same blue dress, but now it felt like her own. Silas stood beside her, his hand holding hers, his touch a promise of a future she had never dared to dream of. They were not two broken souls anymore. They were two halves of a whole, their scars not erased, but transformed into a testament of their strength, their resilience, their capacity to love and to heal. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the valley, Alara looked at the faces of her friends, at the warm light spilling from the windows of her new home, at the man standing beside her, his eyes full of a love that was as vast and as wild as the land itself. The house was no longer a tomb, it was a sanctuary. The silence was no longer a weapon. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet, filled with the promise of shared laughter and future memories. The community had stood witness to their transformation. They had seen them at their lowest, and now they saw them at their strongest. They had seen them broken, and now they saw them whole. That night, as she lay in Silas's arms in the big four-poster bed, the bed that had once been a symbol of loss and was now a symbol of new beginnings, Alara thought of the long, painful journey that had brought her here. She thought of the hunger, the shame, the despair. And she thought of the small, simple act that had changed everything. She had given away her last piece of bread, a desperate act of compassion in a world that had shown her none. And in return, she had been given a life, a home, a family. She had been given love. And as she drifted off to sleep, her head on her husband's chest, the steady beat of his heart a lullaby in the quiet night, she whispered the words that would become the cornerstone of their new life, a truth so profound. It was almost a prayer. Sometimes you have to give away everything you have to receive everything you've ever wanted.